Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. I'm Greg Edge, retired silviculturist with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry.
And I'm Brad Hutnick, Wisconsin DNR silviculturist, still working until I can't find my way back to the truck. And we're your hosts for today's show. Guten Morgen, Mr. Edge.
Hey. Good morning, Brad.
I don't want to be all, mushy here, but I got you a Christmas gift.
Aw, that's so nice of you. You didn't have to do that.
Yeah, and it's a little past Christmas, but, it is what it is.
Yeah, what is it?
I noticed that you're, getting a little thin up top lately, if you know what I mean. Now, and it's not a bad thing.
Oh.
Less hair, more head, as they say.
Gee, thanks, Bradley. That is so considerate of you.
Oh, go on. Now, you're just supposed to rub a little of this goop on top of your head every day.
Gross.
And soon it'll restore a thick, full head of hair. Now, come on, you don't want to hang on to that degraded stand, my friend. And what do you have to lose, Greg?
My dignity? Oh, it looks like motor oil.
Well, that just means it's potent, my friend. Potent.
Hey, Brad, why don't you try it first? I noticed pheasant hunting this fall that the sun bounces a little more brightly off your head these days, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, Greg, you seem to be missing the point of the experiment here. Now, if we see positive results restoring your head, then perhaps we'll expand the testing population. If, on the other hand, you start looking like a chia pet, well, maybe we'll just cut this experiment short.
Okay. I'm going to start sprouting green Brussels sprouts up there or something?
We're going to find out, Greg, so have at it.
Okay, well, first of all, Bradley, I would not consider my hair a degraded stand, at least not yet. And secondly, I have become wise to your experiments. As always, I seem to be the test subject in these things.
Yep, it's true.
However, it is timely that you're thinking about restoring degraded conditions, because today on SilviCast, and this is our transition, we'll be talking with John Stanturf, visiting professor at Estonian University of Life Sciences and senior forest restoration specialist at InNovaSilva. John, as you know, I know you know, has conducted forest research in temperate and tropical forests throughout the world for over 30 years, specializing in the functional restoration of degraded forests.
Yeah. Greg, as you know, I'm a huge fan of John's work over the years. He's really helped me understand the concepts behind restoring and rehabilitating degraded forests and the foundation for a lot of our conversations that have gone on with that. And I'm sure he can even help with your hair, too.
And yours, of course.
Yeah, and mine.
Thank you to our season sponsors, Family Forest Carbon Program and Nelson Paint Company. You make the SilviCast world go round.
John Stanturf, welcome to SilviCast. For our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about where you work, who you are, and what you do?
Well, that could take the whole podcast, but I'll try to keep it short.
Yeah.
I'm semi-retired. I spent 26 years with the U.S. Forest Service, retired going on 8 years ago now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. Since then, I've been a visiting professor at the Estonian University of Life Sciences. And people are always very curious about that. And just briefly, I started working with those colleagues back in the 90s when they got independence from the Soviet Union. And it's just developed. And so when I retired, I wanted a university connection. And that was the one that fit the best. So even though I'm a visiting professor there, I live in upstate New York, actually in Rochester, New York.
Wow, cool. And you've had a lot of, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but you've had international forestry has been kind of cooked into you a little bit. So looking into your background, it looks like you worked early in your career, you worked in Israel on forestry as well, correct? Or with
right
stuff.
Yeah, I had a postdoc there for a year.
Yeah, which is fascinating because I was just reading an article about early tree planting in Israel as kind of a way to, I don't know, it was like a nationalized spirit for, like plant the trees, and then the Jewish holiday for planting trees as well.
Right. To be shot. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's still a big deal. Yeah.
It's fascinating though. So that was really cool.
Yeah. So probably should mention that I grew up in an army family and we lived in Germany for 6 years. So from an early age, I've had an international outlook.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking about really your focus for years on forest restoration. And it's kind of neat to see that international connections, because there's, as you know, so much going on in terms of restoration and restoration need across, not just in our country, but across the world. So that's neat that you're bringing that to the conversation.
And maybe just to start us off, we can talk about it really broadly and then kind of work through some things with this. How would you broadly define forest restoration?
I think the simplest way to define it is it's reversing degradation. So it's taking the opposite trajectory, the opposite path from degradation. The actuality is, of course, much more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's true. It's like between two poles, right? So you kind of have degradation, kind of this at one end, and then what's at the other end of that then?
Well, the way I've expressed it is this idealized native forest. I hate the word natural, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that later, but
yeah,
the native forest is this idealized, and everyone has their own ideal of what that is, whether it's a very primitive forest with no human influence or, something a little more managed. That's different perspectives that have come to play. One of the things that's talked a lot about in restoration is what is that endpoint that you're striving for?
From a forester's perspective, John, do you see foresters as restorationists, or is that like a distinct role in the profession or other professions, being a restorationist?
Yes.
Yes to all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah. The way I look at it is that forest restoration does and should use the tools of silviculture. I mean, silviculturists, we have a lot of experience in how to manage and work with nature and forest. It's applied ecology, if you will. And so we should be using those tools in restoration. In practice, though, that sort of the line between normal silviculture, normal forestry, and restoration is pretty blurred. And I think it depends on what it is on the ground. To me, restoration comes into play when the forest ecosystem has been so disturbed or so degraded that you can't rely on sort of self-renewing natural processes. It takes a little bit of a nudge to move it in the right direction. I guess that's why I can't give you a definitive answer about that.
I like that, thinking about it from the terms of silviculture, because Brad and I have had this conversation a lot with foresters about not painting themselves into a corner as a one-trick pony, but understanding silviculture covers a broad range of many different objectives. And so, foresters may be working in the realm of a more traditional, what we would consider restoration to some native forest type, or they might be working, more of a production forestry and plantation, but silviculture covers all of those ranges. So I like just thinking about that in terms of the applied process of silviculture, and we just apply it based on what all the different goals are.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And being very clear about what your objectives are is important. I think that, to me, what we've seen over several hundred years has been the flow of silviculture has been towards simplifying and predictability. But restoration is going in the opposite direction of complexity and resilience. And I think what we're seeing in academic silviculture, anyways, is a movement in that direction. The silviculture complexity of Hootman and Bauhaus and those people I think that's the forefront of, and it's always been there, but now we're putting more emphasis on it in silviculture, and that's working down at the ground level in applied forest management more and more.
Yeah.
It strikes me, Greg, and oftentimes, and I think, John, you probably see this too, it seems like we talk about restoration and we talk about forestry, and they're two different worlds.
Yeah.
So when we think about prairie restoration or savanna restoration, or like here in the upper Midwest, we talk about things like that. And then we have forestry, which I think foresters are just a little uncomfortable saying that they're restorationists, that they're doing restoration, even though they might be doing it. And I suppose it's because of maybe perceptions of how the term has been used in the past.
Yeah. I think the three of us are old enough to remember some of the consternation when ecosystem management came in, and there was a feeling amongst especially field foresters that they were being criticized for what they'd done in the past. That this new thinking was saying, well, everything you've done in the past is wrong and we need to do it differently. And so there was a bit of defensiveness that came up, understandably.
Yeah.
And I think we're hopefully beyond that today, and because the challenges are facing everybody, and they're just immense, and we've got to work together on it.
I hope there's a broader recognition of all those range or various goals that come into play on land management. And it's, as I said, not one thing, one size fits all, but we manage based on those objectives. And so maybe those perceptions are changing.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, we mentioned it earlier, and maybe it's good to go think about what it was. Well, we talked about restoration and then maybe that idea of degradation. So maybe it's time to dig in a little bit about what degradation itself is, because it seems like, this could take a number of different forms as well. So how would you kind of define or think about a degraded forest?
Yeah, that's certainly something that's been discussed a lot. And, there's sort of three official, if you will, definitions of degradation. The FAO, or the CBD, the Commission on Biological Diversity, and the UNFCCC, the climate change group, all have their own definition of degradation. And they all pretty much coincide that degradation is a diminishment of the ability to provide ecosystem services and functioning of a forest. Where they differ is in the causation. FAO says degradation is degradation, whatever the cause. I'm paraphrasing, of course. CBD says it has to have a human component. It's humans that cause degradation. If humans weren't there, then everything would be fine, basically. UNFCCC is more concerned about the carbon and whether carbon is being affected, carbon sequestration and storage is being affected. So there's these three streams, or these three definitions of degradation, if you will. And they have their commonalities, but there's also these slight differences. So to me, I like the FAO definition that, degradation is what it is. And it doesn't matter the cause, because sometimes it's hard to tease out the cause, or it's a combination of things that, it's attribution of the cause is okay as an academic thing, but maybe it's not so important. Well, having said that, though, that one of the first tenets of restoration is stop whatever is causing the degradation. Otherwise you're just pushing the boulder up the hill.
So, John, Brad and I were thinking about examples just from our world in terms of degradation. And so the obvious one that our foresters deal a lot with is high grading. So just especially in our hardwood stands. So really going into stands where there isn't much good growing stock anymore, or lack of seed sources of desirable species, that sort of thing. So that seems like an obvious one, right?
Yes, absolutely.
From a human cause standpoint. And then Brad and I got into this, I guess, philosophical debate.
No alcohol involved, Greg. No alcohol involved.
So maybe you can solve this one. In Wisconsin, we've had a conversation around black locust, which is a species which is not native to Wisconsin. It comes just to the southern border of the state naturally, but it was planted for various reasons, for agricultural, erosion control, and it also has seeded into other areas. So some people see it as an invasive, and other people see it as, well, it actually, you can manage it, and it is maybe a different forest type. So is that degrading our forest stands, or is that just a new state?
Yeah, well, black locust is a species of concern in a lot of places. The Europeans are concerned about it too, and the attitude towards it differs from one country to another. This is getting all into an entirely different field of invasion ecology too. And there's a lot of discussion there about what exactly are we talking about? Non-native, invasive, exotic, all kinds of terminology. And different people have sort of tried to sort through that. I think that this is an issue that we will have to deal with even more in the future because of the conditions that are changing at the edge of a lot of species range with climate change. And so how much novelty are we going to tolerate in our forests and to manage? And that's what it comes down to, is how much are we willing to accept? I would say if the black locust is invading into different ecosystems and, changing the functioning, crowding out other species, yes, then it's of concern. If it's something that's adapting and maybe enhancing the system, why not accept it? If it's something that's going to be, maybe it'll be like some of the other species that we're dealing with. They'll be the last one standing when climate changes in the wrong direction for us. So let's be happy we've still got a forest cover. That's kind of the real pessimistic view, I guess.
As you said, maybe that idea of native on the other end is a little bit depends on your objectives and what in the situation you're talking about.
Greg, what I hear John saying is Brad was absolutely correct in that conversation that you had with Greg. So I'm not sure if you got caught that, but
you just can't sell me on black locust. I'm sorry, Brad.
Yeah. All right. We'll keep working.
It does make good fence posts. I'll give you that.
But it is one of those things where it's like context matters, right? So because like we have the example here, we kill it in prairies. We don't want it going into prairies, but then we have silvipasture advocates that are working with black locust as a part of what they're doing for the structure and function for what they want. And so it's, like you said, it's really the devil's in the details.
Yeah. We're going to be facing these questions with assisted migration with a lot of different other species too. So these are real concerns. And it gets down to what your perception of native and naturalness is, which is embedded in all these discussions about restoration as well.
So, John, thinking about degraded stands, as I said, we work in them, unfortunately, a lot. We talk to our foresters many times about having good stand assessment as really sort of foundational in developing a good silvicultural prescription for the stand. Yet I know that foresters struggle oftentimes on deciding whether a stand is degraded or not, because it could be, as you said, a little bit in the eye of the beholder, and there's like this really kind of wide range of sort of graduations of degraded. I'm just thinking from a field-based perspective, are there indicators that foresters can look at within stands to try to make those decisions about whether it's degraded or not?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are probably some of the things they may already be looking at, but change their perspective a little bit on that. I think a good stand assessment, knowing where you are, a good baseline is critical in anything we do. We're going to try to change it. To me, I think it's important for a forester to have a good mental picture of what a healthy stand would look like based on his or her experience and evidence, what we learned from manipulating stands. That probably changes over time, but it also then brings in, well, what's the objective that you're looking at the stand for? What are you looking for? What would be the indicators of not good to you? So what I would say, or what I would do if it was me looking at a stand, I'd just, go through the same things probably everyone else looks at. What does individual trees look like? Do they have good crowns? And of course, all of these are in reference to some baseline or some mental picture you have of what it should look like. Are there signs of excessive disease on the trunks? Does that look outside of the range of normal to you? Is the stand adequately stocked? Is it understocked or overstocked? And of course, that depends on species composition and age of the stand. So, these are not things that you can put a one number on. It's something that's going to change over time as stands develop. And then what's the condition of the soil surface? Do you see signs of soil erosion? Are there big coarse roots sticking up above the soil surface? Is there sign of a lot of rutting or compaction, maybe from, a lot of machinery moving around in the stand? Of course, over time, some of these things are going to get camouflaged as the stand develops, and you may not see some of these things right away. But these are just, walking through, this is the kind of stuff you can see. And then to the high grading thing that we talked about before, is there advanced regeneration of the species that we would think would be not only desirable from whatever objective standpoint we're bringing to the frame, but also from what you would expect to be there, given the site, the climate, the so-called natural forest. What should the species composition be? And then in the understory, are there invasive species? There's a lot of things that I know are invasive that I probably couldn't recognize in the field, but we should be better at recognizing those things. A little aside here, back when I lived in Georgia, I spent 3 years fighting privet in my backyard.
Yeah.
Hard to get rid of that. So in a forest, that's even worse. Yeah. So, and then there's just awareness of the kind of stand management that's been practiced. What were people trying to do? Were they successful or not? And then we have, the special instances in fire adapted forest. Is there an accumulation of hazardous fuels because of fire suppression? In a wet forest, are there signs that the normal inundation regime has been changed? Is it too dry or too wet for you can usually tell by the overstory species are there. Would they have been able to regenerate under the inundation regime that you've got today? So those just some of the things. And then probably something that's not going to be encountered by foresters in your neck of the woods, but in the tropics and other places where I've worked, signs of encroachment, especially into protected areas, is a big thing that you look for. People just coming in and farming in areas where they shouldn't be.
I was going to ask what kind of encroachment, but you're talking like human land use encroachments into that forest. Yeah. What I like what you said, John, and Brad, you and I talk a lot with foresters about that. Foresters are the local experts. Like they start to know and learn their forest, and to think about what those baselines look like that you're talking about based on their habitat types and their forests at various stages, I think is really important, because as you said, you need something to compare it to.
Yeah.
And then it can give you an idea of what the different, say, soils and habitat types in your area can develop, what's its potential, is really, I think, a good way to start to look at that.
I wonder, because sometimes maybe having like a really open eye to it too, based on some of that. So thinking about, John, you said you're in upstate New York, and thinking about here in Wisconsin, if I walk into a solid sugar maple stand that maybe formerly had a ton of species diversity, I might say, hey, this is fine for production, but in a way, ecologically, we're degraded. We have lack of capacity for adaptation and some other things. So that feels to me like sometimes there might be some tough realizations too. Like it might not necessarily be, like it's a scale of degradation, but it's still not maybe the ideal for something like that.
Yeah, and then that gets to being very clear about your objectives.
Right.
If your objective is production, and you feel that kind of simplification is going to be resilient under future climate conditions, then yeah, go for it. Why not? We need it. But if it was I'm trying to think of another species that sugar maple is probably one that's not going to thrive under a lot of conditions. Red maple, on the other hand, has, gotten a bad rep, but it's a good species too if it's managed correctly and not abused.
Right.
So things are changing, and we have to be, I think, fairly humble about our ability to predict what is going to be the result of some of our actions in the forest. So we should try to keep it as resilient as possible.
Yeah. And just thinking about degradation, would we want to take a look at the landscape around our area as well to
Yeah.
kind of inform it? Because I know oftentimes we get trapped at the stand and then we don't really think about what's happening around us, but sometimes maybe it's something we can do something about. Maybe it's something just to take into account.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that has come to the fore in the restoration field of looking at forest landscapes rather than small stands. And we'll probably talk about different approaches to restoration where that comes to play, that scale. Yeah, and in looking at landscapes, you're looking at future land use. Just to give an example from the restoration standpoint, in Brazil and the Atlantic forest restoration, they've done a lot of work, and there's a whole cooperative of different organizations involved here, but they've decided to focus their efforts on restoring areas that are remote from where likely land use change is going to happen. So that's a realization that, yeah, there's urbanization, there's farming, there's other things. Rather than fighting that, let's put our limited resources into places where it's fairly remote from those things happening. So that's an awareness of landscape dynamics and land use dynamics that's important in deciding where to work and what to do. Yeah.
Season 7 of SilviCast is made possible thanks to sponsors like the Family Forest Carbon Program. The Family Forest Carbon Program pays landowners to improve the health of their land and increase the long-term value of their property. The program equips landowners with resources and support to implement sustainable practices that help them reach their own goals for their woodlands, while also improving the health of their forests and our planet. To learn more about how you can access these benefits for our forests, visit familyforestcarbon.org.
John, in some of your work that Brad and I read coming into this conversation, you talked about that scale of starting with degraded and then moving to, you mentioned earlier, a native forest, and sometimes referred to as a natural forest. And I think before we go on, we should just maybe touch on that a little bit. Like, what does that mean? And is it always involves some target of a historical condition? Like, are we always trying to bring back what was, or is it much broader than that? What is that other end of the spectrum look like to you?
Yeah, that's a big topic. One of the most contentious debates I get into with people is whether a plantation is a forest. Yeah, which gets right at the nub of, what's natural, what's native, that kind of thing. But yeah. I think this whole idea of naturalness and nativity is it's embedded in the whole restoration field. People have different perceptions of what that means. I think, a really good reference that I wrote into is a publication back in the 90s by a fellow named Davis. He was working out west, and he wrestled with this idea of naturalness, and he came up with 3 indicators of naturalness. And I think these are very much what I see in the field today. The first is what would be the nature of the system if you took humans completely out of it. And that's what a lot of people strive to do with restoration. Personally, I think that's a futile effort because we are so pervasive that it's hard to take humans out of the picture. We see that even in some of the tropical forests that we've considered pristine and little affected by humans. As they really get into it, they're finding, oh yeah, those folks were actually gardening this forest. That's why we have,
right,
more Brazil nut in the forest than would normally be there, things like that. So that, I think, is probably not a great indicator, but the degree of human influence would be important in deciding whether something was natural or not. The second thing that Johnson talked about, or Davis talked about, was the energy subsidy supplied by humans required to maintain the functioning. Now, I read that as how much management is necessary to overcome natural tendencies. And he was writing back in the 90s, at the time when Howard Odum was coming up with ecological energetics and the whole flow of energy through systems. So I think that's why he phrased it that way. So to me, it's the level of human input, the level of management that's necessary to maintain the system and the state that is there. The third one is the one that probably a lot of people talk about is what's the complement of native species currently in the area compared to the suite you would expect. So that's where the reference condition comes in, and the discussion, the argument that we have about, well, what's the proper reference? What should we be trying to do? Is it historical or is it something else? And that depends on your approach to restoration. So you can see the similarities here to the degradation trajectory I talked about and reversing that trajectory in restoration. So even if you remove humans from the system's dynamic. It's not static. It's not going to stay the same way that you see it or your grandfather or grandmother saw it. It's going to change. We know that. It's inevitable. And now we're beginning to realize it and deal with it more. There's that concept of natural range of variation. So yeah, okay. So there is going to be variation the way stands develop and what happens over time. And whether the whole idea is about succession. That's a whole other thing. Where I worked in bottomland hardwoods, we had to recognize that there were some predictable trajectories of stand composition based on the stand development, aging, and when different disturbances happened to replace species in the stand. There was also the whole thing about river processes changing. So, river changed course. So yeah, it might have been the river bottom at 50 years ago, but now the river's changed course and you've got a cottonwood stand growing up there on that site. So those things change. So that, realizing the dynamics of ecosystems is something that we have just, I would say, in the last 50 years started to incorporate into our understanding of ecology and silviculture. And we're just at the beginning of that. We're just at, the fringe of understanding that complexity and those dynamics.
What I took away from some of the reading getting ready for today is kind of that a natural or native forest really isn't fixed, or I'm sorry. So it's kind of this range of conditions that could have occurred. And so trying to pick one arbitrary place may be problematic. You might have to pick one in order to have targets, but it's not like there is one only that you might have a multiple possible pathways to take.
Right. And one of the drawbacks of picking one only or even several is that the conditions that develop that forest, establish that forest, may not be operating today. So it may not be possible to get those same results or that same type of forest composition and structure today.
Yeah.
So, and especially tomorrow with climate change.
I just had that conversation about bottomland hardwoods with some colleagues of mine on the upper Mississippi and trying to figure out those successional pathways. Now that we have a lock and dam system that's really changed the rules of the game on that. So it's just interesting, as you said, Brad, there's this wide range, and then all of a sudden you have a system that's maybe not operating the same that it was.
And what we found in the Delta in the South was that when people talked about restoring hydrology as a restoration method, they weren't restoring hydrology. They were changing it because you couldn't go against the Corps of Engineers and the regional drainage and change that they had done. You could do something locally, but
right.
Yeah. And then you had to worry about your neighbors, because if you flooded the neighbor's farm because you blocked up a drainage channel, then you were in trouble there too. So
yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say, John, that other end of the spectrum, that natural forest, there's a wide range there, and we can't decouple it from what the objectives and the facts on the ground that we're dealing with there are.
That's a good way of putting it. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think maybe this takes it down to, and I thought some of the things that you did really well were kind of define some paradigms and maybe some terms that we can use within those, because it kind of makes it so that we're all maybe speaking the same language, or we're all kind of, it's very, restoration is so broad that maybe we can kind of bring some terms down. So you had a couple of papers where you talked about 4 paradigms for what we do in restoration. and those were revegetation, ecological restoration, forest landscape restoration, and functional restoration. So maybe you could kind of explain what those are and maybe the differences between them.
Sure. Yeah. Revegetation is the kind of restoration that's been going on for centuries. We didn't call it restoration then. We just called it, we were trying to fix something that was broken. It was trying to counter soil erosion or salinization or overgrazing or something by putting trees in the landscape. So the paradigm then was, let's get it green, don't worry about the species. And sometimes we couldn't worry about the species. We could only do what we could do because the sites were so degraded. Good example of that would be the degraded heathlands in Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. The only thing that they could grow in Denmark on those lands to begin with was Austrian pine. Now, because the pines have changed the whole ecosystem and the microclimate and the soil, broadleaves can be established into those stands. So they were doing restoration. They didn't call it that. They were reclaiming the land. So that was kind of the original or this long-term thing about restoration. And then ecological restoration was a development where we say, well, it's not just about stopping the degradation and getting trees in the landscape. It's about what trees are there. So the species composition became important. And then this idea of restoring to some historic past. And of course, in North America, our historic past would go back to pre-Columbian times or pre-European colonization, or however you want to phrase it. And then there's that whole mystique about the ecological Indian and native indigenous peoples didn't really affect the environment very much, which we're coming to find was not really true.
Right.
My favorite thing was, the story that was told in the South by Bartram and others was that a squirrel could go from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and never touch ground. Well, what Bartram was looking at was the second growth forests after diseases killed off the native peoples.
Yeah.
So that he wasn't looking at the original forest. So that's the historic aside, but that's kind of the trap of not understanding land use history that a lot of people can get into. So anyway, ecological restoration really developed out of practitioners trying to restore usually small areas, we would call them stands, patches, whatever, to some naturalness or historic framework, historic endpoint. About people would set the time frame at about the year 2000. The people working in the tropics, especially, were frustrated with the kind of tree planting, afforestation that was being funded by the World Bank, which was planting exotic species on traditional ownerships without any regard to the effects on the local people. So it was a response to that where they said, no, wait a minute, there's something more important going on here. We should be doing this differently. So forest landscape restoration then became the vehicle for that. And the difference between that and ecological restoration was it put people into the frame. It said we should put equal weight on restoring ecological integrity and human livelihoods. So that was a sort of a shift in thinking on two fronts. It expanded the looking at restoration from the small stand or individual stands one at a time to, well, what's the whole landscape? What should that look like? So landscape and then people were added to the picture there of restoration. Functional restoration is really kind of at the intersection of those two viewpoints. It says, yes, we should restore, we can restore it for different objectives. It's more important to restore the functions of forests than some historic past condition. And it doesn't specifically bring or allow human livelihoods into the picture, but in practice, it should. So it's kind of forest landscape restoration light, if you will. So it's where my head's at. It's the technical aspects of how do you restore, and then the social scientists can worry about the people. That's not really the way I think about it, but that's an extreme view. Tell me what you want. I'll tell you how to get it done.
And so with that functional, is it more like what the system or what the forest is doing as opposed to like the individual pieces being the important part? So I'm thinking of an example. Maybe we have pine plantations that maybe in an area that maybe don't have forest, but we still like the idea that there's forest cover, or forest cover plays a certain role for like bird species in an area. So we'd say, even though it might not have been something that was there before, functionally, it's giving us something that we want.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where that argument about whether, it's a plantation of forest or not comes into play. It's providing forest functions, maybe not to the full extent of the potential of the site, but it is providing functions. And, back to what we talked about earlier about sort of the flow of silviculture, of simplification and predictability. Well, now we're saying that we have different objectives, that we're allowing for complexity. We're trying to manage for complexity. So in a landscape, and you see this, a lot in the tropics where they have these vast areas of exotic plantations, there's a requirement for natural native forests along river courses, riparian areas. So there's a place in the mosaic of the landscape for both kinds of forest, and they're providing forest functions with different emphasis, but it's all forests, to me anyway.
Brad, I keep thinking of our friend Doug, who wanted us to do an episode on plantations, fake forests.
Yeah, that's right. We'll bring him in at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, we're working on it, Doug.
Yeah. That'll be the SilviCast after hours episode. Yeah.
Well, people have this view of plantations as always being exotic species and monocultures and intensively managed, but a lot of so-called native forests or natural forests around the world were planted forests. They weren't managed intensively, but they were planted. So we get all hung up with a lot of baggage on some of these terms that get misused and misunderstood. And I'm like you guys, I'm always fighting against that. Let's be very precise in the terms that we use, and everybody understands the same thing about them instead of arguing past each other.
Yeah.
Some of this also reminds me of a past conversation we had about the triad approach of, some places on that landscape are intensively managed, others are reserve areas, and others are somewhere in between. So maybe that kind of fits into that forest landscape restoration idea.
Yeah.
Well, you had three more terms that I think actually kind of dig down, and you probably can apply these within each of them. And so these were rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reclamation. And I think this is really good because I think the terms allow us to be real specific. And like we've talked about in the past, Greg, one of the good things and bad things about forestry is that, we're talking to people in the future about what we're doing right now. And so if we're not very precise about what we're doing right now, then their ability to interpret what we were doing is always limited. So us using terms and using them correctly, and then being able to convey that to both our colleagues and to people in the future who are working with these things are great.
Mm-hmm.
So there were three more: rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reclamation.
Yeah. I probably use those terms differently than many people do. People that come from the ecological restoration paradigm would say those are not real restoration. Those are things that you do that aren't quite restoration. But to me, they are. Again, it's along that trajectory where I use the term reclamation when the site has been so degraded that trees or forest would have a hard time naturally establishing there. So think of mined land, or in particular mine land, or something that's been so degraded, so polluted. Maybe an example from northwestern Pennsylvania would be brine spills, where from oil wells where just flushed the whole area with a high saline concentrated brine, and what develops after that. So reclamation then is when you've got a physical barrier to restoration that has to be overcome. If you go back in time, reclamation had a little different meaning, and that should probably be brought into the discussion here. Because, right now we have a Bureau of Reclamation, and that's all about irrigating the arid lands. So reclamation was the idea that, well, there's all this wasteland out there that needs to be made productive. So that's a little different in the sense that, for me, the reclamation is on the degraded site where that time and place, it was land that was not productive in our view, and we were going to make it so. So it was fixing nature rather than repairing nature. So that was reclamation. And then rehabilitation would be where you have a biological barrier to restoration. So rehabilitation, I applied that to where you were no longer satisfied with the kind of forests that were there, and they needed to be rehabilitated. So the high-graded forest would be a good example. Another example would be plantations or planted forests of species that were probably beyond their native range, like they're discovering in Europe now with Norway spruce, is no longer a viable candidate in a lot of places because of changing temperature and precipitation. In Denmark, it was never a good one. It wasn't wind stable. So that was something that they dealt with. So there was a movement, especially probably beginning about 25 years ago in Central Europe, of rehabilitating those kinds of stands into mixed species or other species. So that was changing the species composition or structure, was rehabilitating the stand. And then reconstruction I used for those areas that had not been forest for some time. Afforestation would be the active way of restoring. And then you have the passive restoration, just kind of leaving it alone or fencing it to keep the animals out, that kind of thing. So natural regeneration, essentially.
So you don't have a physical barrier necessarily. It's just you don't have the players in place.
Right.
And you either got to let them naturally move in or you move them in yourself.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I personally love those because I think that really helps us. And it's just a matter of everyone kind of using the term. So hopefully, us talking about it here will get people, hopefully, at least our 3 listeners will start to use it.
Well,
so.
I think for us, a lot of our foresters would be doing rehabilitation. So we're dealing with existing stands that maybe are missing elements that we want, and we're trying to enhance or bring those back. So we're trying to rehabilitate that stand on that scale. So I keep thinking of your scale from degraded up to a native forest. And we're probably somewhere in the middle a lot of times. It's just not quite where we want it to be because of past history or whatever. And we're just trying to introduce some silviculture to improve those aspects of it.
Yeah.
I think about restoration, and I think about, it seems to me like when restore, and that prefix re, it's kind of going, back to something. We're not going ahead. And I always think about, you watch financial services ads and they say very, very quickly, past performance does not guarantee future results, and you're like, what did he just say, kind of thing. And so it's kind of in restoration, we kind of have that same thing. So can we apply restoration with an eye on the future? It's kind of one of those philosophical things, but I think maybe it's a little more physical or a little more concrete than I think.
I agree with you. I think we must apply restoration with an eye to the future.
Yeah.
I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves and society if we're just looking in the rearview mirror, because things are going to change. Now, having said that, we have to be very clear about where we think we're going to be in terms of future climate, when we're doing this, because there are going to be areas where climate is not going to change that drastically. So we can continue as we have. It's kind of at the margins, though, at the edges of the leading and following edge of species distributions. That's where the real challenge is going to be, is can we maintain the same species? What level of novelty are we willing to entertain? What other species are we going to allow? And how active are we going to be at introducing new species into that frame? Species that maybe are functionally similar to the species that we have. This is something they're looking at in Europe with, what's called Oriental beech, moving it into Western Europe in place of their European beech. It's a question of whether those are really different species, but that's neither here nor there. So, or is it even things like different provenances of our species? So wide-ranging species moving more southerly, warm, drought-tolerant species into the northern forest. And, there's some really great work that's going on in your forest right now with the DREAM project and some others that are looking at exactly those issues. And then getting a little farther afield there, are we willing to accept biologically changed species, biotech that's going to maybe introduce more drought tolerance through gene manipulation or other things? Back to that idea of what's a native species. How much of that are we as a society or individual landowners willing to allow that to come in? And question that's not an exotic question for the future. There's one right now about chestnut. We've got two different streams of trying to bring chestnut in, the traditional tree breeding versus the biotech. I've had an interesting discussion with people about that in the restoration community. They're all about native species. I said, well, do you consider that a native species? How much of that of foreign species in there are you willing to allow? Oh, it's okay as long as it's for restoration. But if it was for commercial purposes, no, we wouldn't allow that. So you get those perceptions and value judgments that come in. But that's the real world. Those are the kinds of things that we as foresters will have to deal with down the road.
Yeah. I thought there was a fascinating, and you'd recall it was like 2014, 2015, there was a commentary and then a series of things on that you were part of. And I think that really kind of talked about that and talked about this idea of restoration. Are we locked to these things in the past, or are we kind of changing it for the future? And we'll make that available in the show notes for people to read. You guys did a really nice job of kind of talking about that same thing.
Yeah, you're talking about that paper with Cass Dumbrose, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing you mentioned in the end of it, and I wrote it down here because I thought it was really cool. You said, perhaps new terminology and, dare we say, a new discipline of transition management or the aforementioned intervention ecology are discussions that are not misguided. So it's kind of even pointing the way forward for maybe we'll have interventionists in the future instead of restorationists.
In a sense, restorationists are interventionists. We are intervening necessarily. And so, yeah.
John, you said oftentimes in restoration, we're nudging a system to go in a better direction. And so Brad and I talk about nudging a lot too. And I think that's a lot of times that's what we are doing and can do, right? Like what we're capable of doing. And then we also talk a lot about time. We often don't give enough time for these systems to develop. And John, you gave an example of plantations in Europe, and then over time that changing that system back to where native hardwoods can move into that system. And so giving that time to happen, I think, is really important. And just recognizing the complexity of the systems that we're working with and how, our thinking has changed to realize, boy, these are complex, and trying to allow for the different pathways. And that ultimate native forest, natural forest, whatever we want to call it, you really can't decouple it from us in terms of what our goals and objectives are for that land. And that's kind of like a basic silvicultural prescription paradigm, right? It's what your site has and what your goals are for that site. You can't decouple those. So those are just some things that struck home with me. And so I was just thinking about, based on your career working with the Forest Service and working with foresters all around the world, do you have any final piece of advice for those foresters who are trying to integrate these concepts into the work that they do every day?
The mantra that I and others are using today is that it's all about the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. Deciding what right is in each of those instances is the difficult question, but it's something that we should each decide for ourselves. So with that in mind, I'd say I would give, 5 pieces of advice. It's not exactly Letterman's top 10 list, but it's the only ones I could come up with.
No, that's good.
Yeah, that's good.
The first one is make sure that whatever the degrading process was is no longer operating, because there's no point in spending a lot of time and effort in restoring something that's going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
And with reasonable expectation that will happen. So that's not always easy to do because you're not always sure what that process was. And that's where land use history and, finding out what the past was is really important before deciding what to do to go forward. And then have clearly defined objectives. I mean, we've talked about this all through the conversation today about having clearly defined objectives. Your objective is not to restore for the sake of restoration. Your objective is to restore for something else. So what is that something else? Being clear and transparent about that, not just with yourself, but with others. And what are you attempting to do? What functions or services are you trying to improve or restore? And then knowing what your starting point is, what's the baseline, which puts some constraints on what you can do, and being aware of that. So what is feasible? And then have a clear idea of what the causal mechanism is that connects the baseline with the future you want. Is your intervention really going to make a difference? Is it going to do what you think it's going to do? And if you can't express that causal mechanism, then you really don't know what you're doing. And then finally, I would say restore for the future, not for the past. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore the past, or it doesn't mean that the future could look like the past, but don't be so locked into restoring something that was there in the past that it's not going to be there in the future because it's not adapted to future conditions. Wish I had more things to say, but that's all I can come up with.
That's fantastic.
I think that as we talked about today, foresters need to communicate those clear goals and pathway to the people that come after them, because so much of this is very long-term and developing. And so just a conversation like we had around, what are the terms that we can use to describe this? What are the processes we can use to think about this so we get all this maybe down in the prescription that we write? I think it's really useful if foresters can apply that into that everyday work.
I agree. Yeah. And I think, too, that we have to be careful that I guess you would call implicit bias. I have to think, well, am I trying to develop, quality timber out there when that's not really my objective? Some of the things that ways I would approach, intervening in the stand may be colored by that bias because, that's what we've done for all these years as foresters. That's been the objective that society has given us. So now we have a little different one. So one of the applications of that is, this is usually in the tropics where you don't have a lot of guidance on what was there in the past. When you're selecting species, it's not necessarily the timber species that people want. It may be species that have other characteristics like fruiting and seed production or the right kind of foliage to use in construction for houses or whatever. So you have to understand what the needs are and what you're really trying to accomplish. And sometimes you can fail to understand that you have these things in your past, your experience and your training that really are not applicable in that instance. So a lot of self-awareness, I guess, is what I'm saying,
Yeah. You got a little bit of being humble, right?
Exactly.
That's great, John. I really appreciate you coming to talk with us today about these topics. And really, I think it'll give foresters something to think about as they're trying to develop this, more at their local level. Because as we started out today, I think foresters are really restorationists practice. And that's what silviculture is oftentimes doing. So it really helps us think through these things.
I think just this conversation, I think this is a conversation that we've probably been avoiding in forestry for some time too. Like we don't really think of ourselves in this context, or we're afraid of the conversation because that's just not a place we've often talked. So I think this frees us up to have that conversation. It puts us in that world, which I think is really good. And it again frees us from those bonds of just being like, what did you say, Greg? We're from a one-trick pony. We're not just about this. We can do lots of different things.
Well, great. Thank you very much, John.
Yep. Great conversation.
I enjoyed it.
Brad, that was a really good conversation with John, and it got me thinking about silvictionary, for one thing.
Ride the Silvosaurus.
And something that we have in our silvicultural guidelines, particularly some work that we did on our Northern Hardwood chapter around growing stock classification systems.
Yeah.
So this is this whole concept of AGs and UGs. And how that relates to what John was saying about criteria for helping foresters decide what that degraded condition looks like.
I like the idea that we integrate stuff into our assessments that really tell us a little bit more about that, like thinking about degradation itself. And Greg, I have to admit, I didn't do that when I was a younger forester.
Well, you didn't do a lot of things.
Well, yeah, we did a lot. Well, we got a lot done, Greg.
You did a lot of things.
We got a lot done. But when you think about it, like I remember like looking at data and saying, oh, here's a stand with 80 square feet of basal area. I knew the composition and I knew that it wasn't right for a thinning. So we just said, well, let it grow and we'll come back later on and we'll take a look at it. That's all the data I was looking at. And then having the benefit of being an older forester now.
Much older.
Well, it's older, more a wiser forester, is that now I go back and I look at that stand and I go, oh, I didn't think about this the right way, because now I had 80 square feet of maybe things that weren't great, right? A stand that wasn't great. And now I've got 100 square feet of a stand that's not great.
Yeah, it really hasn't changed.
Right. It hasn't changed that much. And so putting some of those things into your inventory or into your assessment that do that. Now, in what we do with the Wisconsin Silviculture Guide in the Northern Hardwood chapter, we talk about a minimum number of acceptable trees or acceptable growing stock, or a minimum, an amount of it, which I think is a good thing. And I think even just embracing that idea of defining what you're looking at as acceptable growing stock versus unacceptable, to me, that was really big, and it made a huge difference in what I do.
And the other thing, because we like to, I guess, gather ideas, the other thing that we've done in the Wisconsin Silviculture Guide is expand growing stock classifications beyond a two-category acceptable growing stock and unacceptable growing stock to really try to define if you want to use a 3 or even a 5 classification system, if you want lots of detail. But that's what we do, and we've used some work from Ontario and others to help us define those out. But as long as you have a system for defining that growing stock in some way, and then, as you're saying, integrating that into your inventory could have helped you made a better decision back there with that 80 square feet of stand in your early career.
Yeah, and and I think the caveat too is that it's not telling you, because you collect that information, it doesn't tell you what to do. It informs your decision making based upon it. So a great example, I think, if I were younger or a younger forester, actually me way back in the day, right? If I'd seen unacceptable, I would have said, well, we need to get that unacceptable out of the stands. But because that tree doesn't necessarily have saw log potential, doesn't mean it might not still fit with some of our objectives we have for the stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it's that piece of the puzzle that you're getting a more full picture of what's actually happening. And you still have to reflect on objectives and everything else. And I really like, I think, some of our more modern objectives now, as opposed to some of the stuff that maybe I started with. Like simple quality was good, but now maybe thinking more holistically about the forest, I can still use the same information.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Obviously, as we talked with John, it's tied to objectives, right? But it helps inform that. And maybe in that situation, maybe you would have decided to start some type of regeneration process in that stand, try to turn over and develop other species and qualities within that stand. So,
yeah.
So eggs and Uggs, that conversation made me think of eggs and Uggs.
Eggs and Uggs, and more information is always better. Giddy up, words to live by. Well, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or a comment if you like. Remember, we learn best when we wrestle with questions, so please keep them coming.
And of course, take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.